Call to order the Regulatory Review Committee meeting for Thursday, August 8th. Roll call, Dan Ormsby.
Here.
Mark Eastman here. The item is outside agency funding policy.
Thank you. I had talked to a resident who was concerned about finding ways to ensure that the money that the town distributes to outside agencies is spent to the greatest degree possible in Bucksport, and that if there were a way to add that to our review process and analysis, or some sort of adding questions to the application that would require those applying for money to indicate what percentage of their funding on their projects or programs or whatever was spent in Bucksport would be another way to evaluate that would, if it's going to be appropriated, that it would keep the money local. And so what you see as item E on the proposal was language that I put in as a draft just to give you an idea of what that might look like. There would then need to be questions added to the application that somehow got at that. And it says to the greatest extent possible, because it isn't possible to there isn't one of everything that an agency might hire or use in Bucksport. So, but what this does is add a lens that says you need to look here first, sort of, or at least that, I believe, is the was the goal. And so that's the language that was.
I agree with it. I think it's a good idea. My biggest question was, how do we measure it? How do we follow up with it?
It would, the application would have to contain questions that talked about, you know,
what they're doing. And now, would that change not just the money application, but would that change the event application when they're going to do an event? They need to notify us on that too?
Well, the event, our current licensing for event, you know, some public event, there's no criteria in the license application for that. The only what would drive it would be what was proposed in the application to get the money in the first place, not in the subsequent expenditure.
Do you have something to add, Raj?
Just, I think it's a good goal. I would have the same question as how do you measure it, but also, you know, would you put in there something around if pricing is prohibitive? In other words, I can't get the best pricing in Bucksport. That it doesn't make sense to use Bucksport versus using an outside vendor that might be better priced, because we're spending the dollars.
And we got to remember, this is 1% of the budget versus 99%.
So that would be just another question. And just how do you measure, how do you keep track of it?
What would that threshold be? For example, if there's a service that could be provided in elsewhere for $100 and in Bucksport for $125, it may behoove that company, it may behoove that organization to use the Bucksport one. But if it's $1,000 versus $5,000, I think there at least should be a conversation of that threshold. Mm-hmm. That's all.
That's where I think it could get kind of
Get real fuzzy.
challenging to
Yeah.
evaluate. But I think as a goal,
Yeah, an overreaching principle.
If this is something you support, what I would do is make some modifications to the application that would address this, so that when you're considering funding, that you have some idea, at least in a broad sense, what entities have been doing.
I like it.
think one of the questions you could put on the form is, you know, almost 100% of these folks are prior money. You know, have something on there, what was your percentage of use of local assets
Yes.
before, or something like that?
Well, that's what
Yeah.
I mean, is that the majority of them are. I think, is there anyone in the public that
Yeah,
wanted
do you have anyone in the public have anything to add?
Just, how will you monitor what you're talking about? How will that be policed or assessed? How will you
I think there was a lot going on, I don't think you could hear, but that's the same question they had also. I think that's one of the things we gotta figure out.
I think the first step is getting this, and then going from
Getting some
there, and
language.
figuring out what applications and how you're gonna, I think it's a mixture of everything. The original application, what did you do in the past, you know, even some goals for, all right, for this year, what goals do you have, moving forward, and, you know, it's because there are multiple groups that do some, you know, pretty big things that have been year to year to year, so how are we gonna make that so it's part of Bucksport? So,
Okay.
Okay, so I will take a stab at that for the next, and we'll, the
You need a motion?
application. Yes, if you
Yep.
want.
so I'll make a motion to move forward with E of the non-municipal organization funding request evaluation policy.
I'll second that.
No. All in favor?
Okay. Thank you very much.
Motion to adjourn, anyone? Dan?
Motion to adjourn?
And
Second. All in favor?
We can all vote.
We can all vote.